Hello, hi everyone. We're gonna get started. Thank you so much for coming to this event today. The presentation is on combating the business of modern slavery in global supply chain in partnership with the Diversity Week. My name is Sona. I'm a current third-year law student and the president of the Anti-Trafficking Legal Advocacy Society. So human trafficking is a topic that I'm very interested in, so it's very much my pleasure to be introducing our speaker for today's presentation. Professor Genevieve LeBaron has come all the way from the United Kingdom. She is currently a professor of politics and co-director of the Sheffield Political Economy Research Institute. Professor LeBaron is also the co-chair of the Yale University Modern Day Slavery Working Group and editor of the Review of International Political Economy and a UK Economic and Social Research Council Future Research Leaders Fellow. That was a mouthful. Professor LeBaron's research focuses on the political economy of the global labor market, as well as current projects that she's working on include the governance of transnational supply chains, the politics and effectiveness of corporate social responsibility, and the business models of forced labor. She has spent the last 2 years visiting tea and cocoa fields and factories in various parts of the world, including India, in preparation of her new book that she is writing about combating labor trafficking and in the supply chain. And most notably in 2017, Professor LeBaron was ranked the first academic on the global top 100 human trafficking and slavery influence leaders list. So please join me in welcoming Professor LeBaron to give the presentation today. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Hi. Nice to see you. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Sona, for that very kind, generous introduction and for the invitation to be here. It's really nice to be here at the Talsky Center. I was honored to be asked to participate in this fantastic seminar series. I've been asked to speak to you today about modern slavery and to focus specifically on the types of modern slavery that take place in a business context in terms of global supply chains, and to talk about business models. So to start off, I wonder, may I please have a show of hands for how many of you have ever read or listened to a news story about modern slavery? Okay, that's good. That's a lot. Let's just hear briefly from you about these stories. In the stories that you've heard or read, where did modern slavery take place? Has it been in the US or in other countries abroad? Go ahead, share.
US.
Okay. Anyone else? Yeah.
My grandparents worked in Maquiladores in Mexico.
Okay, fascinating. What else? What other stories pop up in the news? Yeah.
Fast fashion, so anywhere like Vietnam, Bangladesh, India, China.
Absolutely. And what about the industries that modern slavery is found in? When you hear about modern slavery in the news, what are the kinds of items that we're buying that you think of as now being associated with modern slavery? Yeah, in the back there.
Food items.
Food, yep. Yep, excellent, yeah.
Shoes like Nike.
Shoes like Nike. Any others? We heard fast fashion, yeah.
Here in the US, the nail industry and the hair braiding industry.
Nail and hair braiding, absolutely. Service sector. What else? Anything else? That's a pretty good range. I would think for many of us in the news that we read and hear are inundated with stories about modern slavery. To name just a few more examples, there was an undercover investigation by The Guardian a couple of years ago, maybe some of you saw that found widespread modern slavery in the Thai prawn industry and linked those practices back to Walmart and Tesco, Costco. There have also been reports by Apple. Apple has actually now acknowledged this, that there was widespread debt bondage in its tier 1 subsidiary factories in China. And we've also heard a lot of modern slavery concerns surfacing around construction lately, in the construction, for instance, of the World Cup Stadium. It seems like if you sort of scratch the surface of many different types of products or many different types of labor, modern slavery isn't that far away. And I think that a lot of these examples, including the ones you're mentioning now, are part of why there's been so much international attention lately to the problem of modern slavery and supply chains. Really, people are interested, especially now, in the links between modern slavery and how it's being fueled by discount-driven consumer markets. Forced labor is a severe form of human rights abuse. And activists, consumers, policymakers, and others have been arguing increasingly that it has no place in our modern economy, especially where it's part of business supply chains that are very profitable. People are arguing that this is a dramatic violation of international human rights law and many other laws as well, national labor law, the laws that abolished slavery beginning in the early 20th century, possibly even laws related to competition, businesses' market behavior, as I had the pleasure of learning about last night from some of your colleagues at dinner. So over the past 10 years or so, as there's been growing concern about modern slavery from kind of all corners, really, there have been calls for corporate transparency and accountability increasing. And in response to those, governments have started to pass new legislation to address modern slavery and bolster transparency in supply chains. So for instance, maybe some of you have heard of the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act. Anyone heard of that? Yep, seeing some nodding in the back. There's another one called the UK Modern Slavery Act that came about in 2015. And in parallel to those government initiatives, you've had a big flurry of corporate initiatives. So companies have invested millions in new responsibility programs that they claim will combat modern slavery. They're expanding different partnerships that they have with NGOs around labor standards. And international organizations like the United Nations are renewing their efforts and commitments to combat modern slavery. So for instance, the Sustainable Development Goals included one goal, number 8.7, which claims it seeks to eradicate forced labor by 2030 and child labor by 2025. So we're only a few years away. So on the one hand, we have all of this stuff happening. There's all these initiatives set up that are trying to combat these practices that many of us are very concerned about. But on the other hand, you have data and research that shows that across many different regions and many sectors of the economy, forced labor abuse is remaining a big problem. It remains endemic. By the International Labor Organization's latest estimate, there are 40.3 million victims of forced labor in the global economy in 2016, as well as 152 million victims of child labor. So there's a long way to go if we're hoping to meet these sustainable development goals. And there's been very little research so far that's looked at whether and to what extent the initiatives that are set up to combat modern slavery are actually working. And by working, I mean, are they addressing workers' practices on the ground? Are they actually leading to better working conditions for people in these sectors around the world? And that's what I'm going to explore in my talk today. And I'm going to do so by sharing with you some research that I've been working on for the past 3 years, which Sona mentioned, which is on the business models of forced labor in global tea and cocoa supply chains. And this project was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council of the UK, and it's involved trying to understand and map and compare the business dynamics of forced labor in supply chains. So really what that means is trying to understand the patterns. Why does forced labor seem to occur in some supply chains and not others? In some portions of the supply chain and not others? Is it more common among some types of businesses? How do businesses make money from it? Really trying to systematize and have a better understanding than we get in the media, where it just seems to pop up at random. And there's not often a lot of analysis of kind of why it manifests in certain parts of the economy and not others. So my research has involved interviews with over 1,100 workers in tea and cocoa sectors in India and Ghana, as well as business actors along the supply chain. And I'll say more about that in a moment. But I first want to just describe the problem of forced labor and the form that it takes in the contemporary economy. So, since this is a law school, I thought I'd better start off with a definition of forced labor so that we understand kind of how it's being defined in these initiatives. So most government and corporate initiatives use the ILO's 1930 definition, which has two main components. Labor needs to be involuntary, and it needs to be enacted under the menace of penalty. And importantly, when the word involuntary is used here, it what they're thinking of is that it needs to be involuntary due to physical or psychological or financial factors. So importantly, it excludes economic forms of involuntariness, which is just to say that if you're working because if you quit your job, you will starve to death, or if you are working because if you quit your job, you will be destitute, that's not encompassed in this definition of forced labor. So it needs to be something above and beyond those factors. If, of course, they included economic coercion within the definition, it would be a much, much larger estimate of forced labor in the world economy. And the second component, that labor needs to be enacted under the menace of penalty, is really referring to the fact that there needs to be an additional form of a coercion that's keeping the worker from removing themselves from the situation. So that could be violence, physical violence, that could be a threat to the worker's safety, a threat to their family. It could be a confiscation of their passport. It needs to be something that explains why, if the worker is in such a bad situation, they can't just walk away from that situation. So modern slavery, the term, is a very nebulous concept. It's used by all sorts of people to mean all sorts of different things. Some civil society groups think that sex work of all kinds is always modern slavery. And it's a very controversial term. It's used very inconsistently. So the concept of forced labor is a legal term, and it has this clear definition. And that's why I use this in my research, and I'll use it in the rest of my talk, except where I'm talking about initiatives that are being set up that are called anti-slavery initiatives. So there are several types of forced labor. The three most common in the global economy are forced labor exploitation, forced sexual exploitation, and state-imposed forced labor. That might be like mandatory military conscription, that sort of thing. And I just put this chart up here to show you the different proportions of each within the global economy according to the International Labor Organization's best estimate. And the key point here is that the majority of victims of forced labor are victims of forced labor exploitation. They're not victims of forced sexual exploitation, even though that tends to gather a lot of the attention of people who are interested in trafficking. And interestingly, I think, given the Talsky Center's work on human rights for women and children, a disproportionate amount of the victims of forced labor in all of these categories is women and girls. So even if you take out the commercial sex industry, you're looking at about 58% of victims of forced labor being women and girls. So it's disproportionately a feminized form of vulnerability to forced labor. And the business of forced labor in forced labor exploitation alone in the private economy is thought to produce illegal annual profits of around US 150 billion per year. So it's not a small business. In terms of the commodities that are dependent on forced labor, you all did a great job. At the beginning, you got a lot of them. Essentially, we see that forced labor thrives where work is labor intensive, where it's low skilled, and where it's low value added. There are dozens of commodities now that are heavily dependent on forced labor. These include those that I've listed here: coffee, cotton, fish, timber, gold, shrimp, nuts. It could also include footwear, different types of garments, and others. And many of these feed into the products like jewelry or computers or phones that we buy in our lives and depend upon. So with that knowledge that many types of goods are now dependent on forced labor for their production, there have been a lot of initiatives that have been developed to try to address forced labor in global commodity chains, which is also sometimes called global supply chains or global value chains. So I thought it's maybe worth putting up a picture and just spending a moment talking about what those are. Does anyone else want to have a guess at describing them? Okay, that's a pretty good definition. So a network of labor and production processes whose end result is a finished commodity. And what we're really talking about here is that as we've had globalization over the past few decades, and as you've had a growth of the world's biggest retail and brand companies, you've had the advent of a low-cost, high-turnover economy. And this has transformed the ways that goods are made in the economy. So for a lot of companies now, instead of employing their own workforces, what they're doing is they're coordinating production of goods through commercial contracts with thousands of arm's length suppliers. So for instance, Walmart, which is the world's largest retailer, they have over 100,000 direct suppliers who in turn source from hundreds of thousands of their own suppliers. So you have very long and very complex supply chains. And this is a picture of a laptop computer supply chain. And the thing I just want to point out here is that if we look at this as a sort of lens into the global labor market, what we see is that the workforce that makes any one product, so for instance, a laptop computer, is actually fragmented across dozens of national borders, meaning there's not just one employer behind the creation of goods, but you have dozens and potentially hundreds of employers whose labor practices are relevant to any one commodity. And so as this has happened, it's become increasingly difficult for government and also for industry to govern labor standards within these supply chains. You have potentially thousands of distinct global supply chain partners, and big brand companies like, say, The Gap or Nike, they will generally include in their contract a supplier code of conduct. And that will have a number of instructions about how firms need to act in order to become their suppliers. And it will usually include a provision such as thou shalt not use forced labor or child labor, and you need to comply with all of the labor laws, et cetera, et cetera. But these contracts are rarely enforced. And suppliers are very creative at finding ways to continue to use exploitative labor practices. So for instance, in the garment industry, there's a big problem with unauthorized subcontracting. They simply subcontract out the sort of shady practices, which is a big issue. Or they sometimes bring them in through labor providers. So by contracting with a third-party labor provider who's not on the books, it means those employees are not on the books of their company, so they wouldn't necessarily be encompassed in a social audit or that sort of thing. So essentially, there are lots and lots of ways that these contracts are not enforced and where people find loopholes in them. So one of the big innovations behind the global supply chain, why has this become such a popular way of making stuff? I think that part of it is about allowing companies to transcend nationally based labor and environmental legislation through various forms of outsourcing and subcontracting, where they can transfer risk and legal liability, as well as the duties of employment onto these supplier firms. And these firms all have responsibilities, as I said, but often they have quite little power in the commercial relationship, and also they take home very little of the profit in some industries. So this chart shows the distribution of value in an iPhone. And the key here is really just that, well, Apple takes home 58.5% in just straight profit. That's that red, big red part of the diagram here. The total portion of value that's distributed to all the workers in Apple's vast supply chain, so the workers that dig out the minerals, that go into the parts, that go into the computer, the workers that make the parts, that make and assemble and package the computer at the end of the day, that sell the computer, all those workers, which is a huge number of workers, they're taking home only 5.3% of all of the value of any one iPhone. So if you look at, that's this little bit here, the little crimson and the little blue part. So that's the portion of the value of an iPhone that's going to workers. And I think that what is relevant about this is that you have a very small slice of the pie in global value chains as compared to other types of models of production that is actually available to be paid as wages. And that becomes relevant, as I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail in a few moments in terms of the issues that we see in tea. I think this is actually kind of, it's not a bad representation of it, but in some types of products, for instance, in the food industry, you'd often see that this share that would go to workers would even be lower than that. So for instance, in cocoa, workers are estimated to take home just about 4% of the final average price of a bar of milk chocolate. And meanwhile, the large food and beverage companies who sell that chocolate are accumulating vast amounts of profit. So Nestle, for instance, reported profits of close to 9 billion in 2017. So there's a big inequality in kind of the distribution of value within these supply chains. And of course, corporate profits, value distribution, worker wages, they're not usually on the table when we talk about modern slavery. Those are seen as a sort of separate issue to the issue of modern slavery. Modern slavery is often portrayed as something that could be eradicated without changing the dynamics of doing business in any way. A lot of the initiatives that I will mention are focusing on transparency. They're focusing on kind of monitoring the practices that exist, not about changing them. And I think that that is part of the issue here. You know, a lot of the time in companies, you have modern slavery being dealt with by the marketing team or the CSR team. And then on the other hand, you have kind of HR and buyers and sourcing in another team, and those two teams don't really work together. There's sort of two different sets of policies and practices. And this is one of the issues that I think we need to start thinking more about in terms of getting serious about tackling forced labor in supply chains. So, moving on, do you recognize any of these logos? Yep. We see them everywhere nowadays on things that we buy. I can confess to agonizing every time I go to the grocery store. Should I pay 5 times as much for this chocolate with this ethical logo, or should I pay half as much for this chocolate without this ethical logo? And being a bit of a nerd, you know, I actually decided to do a study that would kind of answer that question for me, which I'll talk about in a minute. But all of these different logos relate to standards created for ethical products, and those have really exploded in the last few years as companies have come under more and more scrutiny for their labor practices. Companies are investing millions in creating these programs that they are claiming in their modern slavery statements will address and prevent forced labor in supply chains. So clothing retailer, for instance, Abercrombie & Fitch, claim that they've taken proactive steps to mitigate the risk of forced labor and human trafficking in their supply chain. Nike now claims that they take seriously federal and international efforts to end all kinds of forced labor. Companies are positioning themselves as part of the solution to the problem of forced labor, and the main way that they're doing that is twofold. One is through social and ethical compliance auditing. So you see these guys up here are social auditors. They will go into supply chains and monitor practices. And then also through ethical certification schemes. So all of these, Fair Trade is a common one that you'll see, Rainforest Alliance, these are certification schemes that indicate that a product is made with special standards. And in parallel to that, as I mentioned at the beginning, governments have been passing different types of legislation, which is meant to encourage more and more of this type of behavior in supply chains. So the USA, Canada, the UK have passed this type of legislation. Now it's being rolled out across Europe. And a lot of these different laws focus on raising criminal justice consequences for perpetrators of forced labor. They don't really touch on business, but some legislation does what they would call require business to end slavery. And so what they're doing is they're requiring businesses to report on the measures that they're taking to prevent and address forced labor in their supply chains. And when you look at what they say they're doing to prevent and address forced labor in supply chains under this legislation, then we go back to this, because they say we're auditing and we're certifying our supply chain. That's the main thing that we're doing. And one of the reasons that I selected tea and chocolate as my case studies is that they were very well covered by this type of anti-slavery legislation. So these industries are led by companies who've been reporting under this modern slavery legislation for some years now, and also very well covered by these sorts of initiatives. So Fair Trade, Rainforest Alliance especially, but also social auditing has been going on in the cocoa industry for maybe 20 years. So we've had a long history of companies trying to act to address these problems under both public and private governance mechanisms. So one of the reasons that I picked those sectors was because I thought they were sort of ripe for investigation of whether this stuff is working. So if we look at tea to start with, you'll see you can use this thing called the Modern Slavery Registry, and you can use it to look up any company and see what they've reported about what they're doing about forced labor in their supply chain. And if you look up tea brands and companies who own the tea brands, you'll find that many of them publish modern slavery statements under the UK Modern Slavery Act or the California TISC Act. And what are they reporting? well, as I said, they're reporting that they're seeking to address forced labor and exploitation through corporate social responsibility programs. So for instance, Twinings have their own program here, sourced with care, as well as industry initiatives that I showed you a moment ago. So fair trade, Rainforest Alliance, all of these ethical certification schemes, those are the main things that they're doing now to address forced labor. So for instance, Tetley, which is a major tea brand, 86% of Tetley tea is now certified Rainforest Alliance, and they're moving towards 100% certification. And these schemes, Fair Trade and Rainforest Alliance, they claim to make trade and consumption more ethical and more fair. That's their raison d'etre in their words. So if you look at the website of Fair Trade, they say they changed the way trade works through better prices, decent working conditions, and a fairer deal for farmers and workers in developing countries. So it would be reasonable to expect that we would find higher working conditions and lower levels of forced labor on work sites that have been certified with these programs. So turning now to my tea and chocolate study, as I mentioned, I embarked on this big research project. It included a team of 14 researchers who were based in the UK, India, and Ghana over the last 2 years, maybe more like 3 years now. And it turns out that there's very little research on the business of forced labor because it's very slow and quite painstaking to conduct. And I found that out at times the hard way in my project. But through very careful and slow work, we did create a new data set. As I mentioned, we wanted to start by getting accurate information about working conditions on the ground. So we started by interviewing 1,154 workers across 96 different work sites in tea and in cocoa supply chains. And from there, we worked our way up the supply chain, interviewing different types of tea plantation owners, cocoa community chiefs, different types of business actors, certification organizations, all the way to the multinationals at the very top of the supply chain. And then we interviewed a number of actors who we thought could shed light into some of the implementation gaps that we found between exploitative practices at the base of the supply chain and then these sets of initiatives on the other hand. And the reason that I included such a large number of communities and plantations in the study is that I wanted to look at patterns. As I mentioned at the beginning, it would have been much easier to just go to one tea plantation and interview many, many hundreds of workers, because, for instance, a tea plantation in Assam might have 10,000 workers. So we could have easily just gone to one and interviewed everyone there. But the reason that we ended up doing it this way is because we wanted to look at patterns. So I included, for instance, tea work sites that were certified, tea work sites that were not certified, some that were owned by multinational corporations, and mostly exporting their tea for consumption abroad versus some that were owned by domestic companies and the tea was mostly for consumption domestically. And really what we're trying to get a sense of here is what are the patterns of forced labor? If we look at these different businesses, is it more common in some than others? And how well are things like certification working to address the problem of forced labor? And what we found was quite surprising. So the popular notion and the notion we hear in the media is that forced labor is a hidden crime, that we would have difficulty finding it, that it's sort of in the shadows of the global economy. And what we found in this study was actually that the indicators of forced labor and labor abuse more generally were very widespread. So every single one of the 1,200 workers in our study had experienced some form of abuse, including verbal abuse, threats of violence, debt bondage, the under-provision of legally required goods and services. In cocoa, there's a practice where workers are required to perform unpaid labor. So for instance, maybe they need to go work on the plantation owner's other farm and they're not paid for that, and it might be for 3 months, and that's a condition of their employment within the cocoa industry. So that's another indicator. There were many, many indicators of forced labor, and they were not difficult to find, and they were very, very widespread. Not all of them, not every worker in our study was in a situation of forced labor, but to start, I think it's important just to look at the big picture, which is that the types of things that are associated with forced labor and the types of labor standards abuses were very widespread in the industry. So I'm mindful of time, so what I'm gonna do is just touch on 3 key discoveries that we made in this project about what is and isn't working to eradicate forced labor in these supply chains. And I'm very happy to talk about any aspect of the project or the research that people are interested in the questions. So the first discovery relates to wages, which is that we found that workers' wages in both sectors are dangerously low. They're very, very low. So the poverty line in India and Ghana in US dollars is about $350 per day. And the average daily wage for tea workers in our study was about 25% of the poverty line. For cocoa workers, it was close to 30% of the poverty line. Yes?
Both sectors you're talking about, like the large-scale corporations owning for shipping the tea overseas versus the small operations, just to clarify.
We're talking about all the workers in the study, so that includes all the different types of work sites.
All right, but you just referred to like both sectors.
So tea and cocoa.
Okay, tea and cocoa.
Tea and cocoa, yeah. Yeah, so in tea, 25% of the poverty line. In cocoa, about 30% of the poverty line. And this is the living wage. So this is a higher figure than what the minimum wage would be. But this is just to give you a sense of kind of what it would cost on a day-to-day basis to have the basic necessities of life in Ghana versus what these cocoa workers in our survey were taking home. There's a pretty big gap here in that. And I think what's notable here is that these figures are well below national and regional minimum wages that should be paid on these work sites, which means that anti-slavery initiatives are not so far addressing wage manipulation and underpayment practices. And that's a problem because in the academic literature, the links between poverty wages and forced labor is very well documented, that there's a lot of slippage between these categories, and that having very low wages leaves workers vulnerable to much more serious forms of abuse. And I'm happy to talk about that more later if anyone's interested. An overlapping problem here was related to the under-provision of basic needs, and this is especially on tea plantations. In tea, plantations are often very remote, and employers are legally required to provide their workers medical care, education, electricity, water, toilets, and other essentials if you're a permanent tea worker, so you have a permanent job, and their families. And the reason for that also relates to the fact that many tea families are second or third or fourth or fifth generation tea families. So you have a lot of tea workers who their family has never left the tea plantation in a couple hundred years. And so the issue with that is because wages have been, you went from having kind of bonded labor to having very low paid labor. Workers have never been able to accumulate enough money to actually obtain these goods themselves, kind of on the open market, if you will. And there's very little development. So employers have to provide these things under the law. But our research found that many plantations' business models are configured around generating revenue by under-providing and overcharging workers for basic services. So for instance, one problem that we found and was reported to us a lot by workers was that they'd be charged for electricity, which is actually legal, they can be charged for electricity, but then it would fail to be provided to them. So they're paying for things that they're not actually getting. Another thing that was reported was that employers were charging predatory rates for goods and services relative to workers' low wages. So among the workers that we interviewed, 47% reported not having access to water, 26% reported not having a toilet, 24% reported they didn't have electricity in their homes at all times. And these things are mandated to be provided by employers. So in the worst cases, and again, not in every case, these different forms of abuse combined to create situations of forced labor. Very often what this looked like was that due to very low wages, fraudulent deductions from pay, being overcharged for basic services, workers easily become indebted. So for instance, a child gets sick, there's insufficient medical care, they borrow a bunch of money at usurious interest rates, and then have to work that off. And so that debt, combined with the lack of means to leave the plantation, is what is combining to make it so that workers have very little choice but to leave these situations, regardless of how exploitative they may be. And in some cases, you know, it may be kind of okay in terms of the day-to-day working conditions that they have. Not all reported physical violence, not all reported gender-based violence, but those were happening in some cases. But in all cases, I think what's really important here is that they had very little control over the terms of their work. So they work on a quota system. They'll get their wage depending on how much tea they pick in the day. And usually you're looking at somewhere, it could be up to 200 pounds of tea in a day that a worker would need to pick to get the wage that I mentioned before. So this can be large. And in times where the market's not doing well, companies are suffering, they may make this number even bigger, right? And so there's a sense in which workers have very little ability to shape their own conditions, and they're sort of stuck with whatever happens. One thing that was reported commonly was that workers who wanted to change employers, so for instance, say they just up the quota, how do they have a situation where workers don't just all flee to the neighboring plantation? Well, in those cases, people mentioned that they would often face penalties, like their wages would be withheld from them entirely. So wages that were owed to them wouldn't be paid, or they would have threats against themselves or their family or that sort of thing. So that is what forced labor sort of looked like in tea. And as I said, the second discovery that I want to mention, it relates to ethical certification. So as I mentioned, we included different types of work sites, and we included all of the main ethical certification schemes used by companies in both industries. So that included Fairtrade, the Ethical Tea Partnership, UTS, and Rainforest Alliance. Rainforest Alliance and UTS have now merged, actually, just in the past year or so. And the overall finding, there's some diversity across these schemes, but the overall finding was that these schemes are not working to create sites that are free from forced labor. Some of the worst cases of abuse that we learned of occurred on certified work sites. On tea plantations, we used, as I said, a dozen different indicators of labor standards to measure labor standards on these work sites. And on most of these, we found very little difference between certified and non-certified tea plantations. So for instance, with wages, you can see here, this is a percentage of workers who have had their benefits withheld. And it's 17.2 on certified plantations compared to 11.7 on non-certified. So on this particular indicator of labor standards, certified plantations actually fared worse. Similarly, when we look at under provision of services for basic needs, as I mentioned, 40% of workers on certified plantations lacked reliable electricity, 46 lacked access to drinking water, 30% lacked access to a toilet. And the important thing about this is that all of these things are supposed to be provided on plantations within these certification schemes. So we actually chose indicators that the certification schemes detail as things that are standards within their schemes, such as all workers will have access to water, they will all be paid the higher between any minimum wages that apply, et cetera, et cetera. In cocoa, we had intended to replicate our same methodology. So our plan was, we did tea first, and then the plan was do the same thing. Make a list of all the cocoa communities, divide them up into certified, non-certified, and do our sample in a kind of structured random way. So with tea, we more or less picked, once we'd created a structured sample, we picked numbers at random out of a hat to decide which plantations. We wanted to do the same thing, but we were unable to do that in cocoa because our team in Ghana found that there was such widespread confusion among businesses, among certification organizations, and among workers about whether or not the work sites that they were working on were certified. So we felt we couldn't credibly measure the difference between certified and non-certified work sites when it came to labor standards. One thing that was really interesting to us was that farmers reported that they use the same labor standards to produce certified and non-certified cocoa beans. So there, they would sell beans as certified or not certified, and if you sell them as certified, you get a bit of extra money, you get a premium on top of that. But what they explained to us was that the premium that they would get for the certified beans wasn't actually enough to cover the higher standards that were necessitated with those beans. So for instance, not using child labor or not using forced labor wasn't affordable for them. And so they claimed that the premiums that they were receiving were insufficient to cover the costs of the standard. And I think part of what we have to look at here, when you think of what explains this big gap between these certification schemes and then what we found on the ground, there are many factors which I'm happy to talk about, but one of them is around weak verification systems. So one representative of a certification organization said they only actually audit a sample of about 5% of the farms that are certified by their scheme. So for the other 95%, they're mostly self-reporting most of the time what their labor practices are. And that's one of the reasons that we found these big gaps, I think, between practices and the standard set. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I got a ton of questions, and I can interject as I clearly already did. Or I can wait to the end, whichever you prefer. I've already interrupted. I apologize.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
So with the certification, these
Yeah.
are private certifications.
Yeah.
And earlier in your presentation, you talked about potentially, are there also government certifications? And are there government certifications local to those countries? Are those effective? Because we're only talking about the private ones now, and I don't remember if you said that there was also government certifications and how effective they were.
That's a great question. So with tea, there's a local certification. It's not actually a government certification. It's called Trustee. So that is a certification that was set up by local Indian businesses in the domestic market. And we did look at sort of variation in effectiveness across the different schemes, but we've anonymized that within our reporting of the sample because we didn't want people to sort of just say, oh, well, rainforest is better and these guys are the problem or vice versa. We felt that that would distract from kind of the overall message because there wasn't significant enough variation between them to feel like we could confidently say this one's better and this one doesn't work. In terms of government, so in cocoa, the whole cocoa industry, there's something called COCOBOD, which is the government cocoa board who mediates the sale of cocoa within the market, but they don't make ethical certifications. So I suppose there are local and regional and national laws that would apply, and they don't appear to be well enforced, but there aren't sort of specific ethical standards that have been made by the government in these cases. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Okay, so now for some good news, because that's all kind of bad news. And I don't want to have it be just all bad news. But I think the third discovery that we made in this data set is better, which is about what's working. We looked at our data at the individual level to see what factors could predict who would be more likely to end up in situations of forced labor. And we looked at things like gender. We looked at age. Is it young people versus older people? Is it migration? Some migrant workers in our study. And actually, it wasn't any of those variables. The number one predictor in our sample, which again isn't a massive sample and it's not supposed to be representative statistically, but it's enough to sort of make this an interesting finding that deserves more explanation, is contract type. So whether a worker had a temporary or permanent job contract in the tea industry was the most important protective factor for workers in terms of whether they would have better conditions or worse conditions in the industry. So just to begin to conclude, I want to reflect on why forced labor is and overlapping more minor forms of exploitation are so widespread in the supply chains that we investigated, and share some quick reflections on why such practices continue to thrive in the face of all the anti-slavery initiatives that we mentioned earlier. In the first case, so why are forced labor and overlapping forms of exploitation so widespread in these industries? Again, I mentioned the history of forced labor in the industries. I think that that's really relevant. There are many and very complex factors that tie into this, ranging from inadequate enforcement of labor regulation, the role of ethnicity, caste, and gender. I'm not going to focus on that today. Today, I'm just going to focus on one driver, which is around prices, because I think that that is something that's really not talked about very much in conversations about forced labor. Over and over again, the cocoa farmers and tea plantation owners and managers that we spoke to emphasize that they don't receive sufficient payment for tea leaves or cocoa beans to pay minimum wage. And at first I thought that was quite a mysterious sort of way to displace blame. And we did some math and found out that in many cases, there does seem to be some credibility actually to that claim. And the reason is, as they explained it, in tea, plantation owners emphasize that there's a very difficult business environment that they're operating in. There have been rising costs and declining prices in tea. One plantation owner described, if you're a plantation owner labor is 80 to 85% of your cost of doing business. And at the moment, prices of inputs are going up, machinery, petrol, diesel, labor, and gardens are getting paid less and less by buyers for the tea that they grow. Margins are tight for growers. All the money now is in packaging, processing, and marketing, not in growing the tea. Rising labor prices are having a huge impact, and some gardens are no longer economically viable. And this was a similar story that we heard also from cocoa farmers, who tend to be much smaller scale businesses, where the government subsidies for things like pesticides have really gone down in recent years. Labor costs are going up. And so the market is changing in ways that make it very difficult for producers. They're not getting paid very much, going back to that pie chart we looked at, and that is shaping the labor practices that they're being used, that they're using. So I think this issue of unequal value distribution, thinking back to that pie chart I showed at the beginning, is really important. Companies at the top of these chains are maintaining very wide profit margins despite rising production costs and falling prices. And producers are under pressure, and forced labor in some cases becomes a viable strategy for how they're staying in business. So just to kind of wrap up here, my study suggests that forced labor is not a random or individualized occurrence that's inflicted onto a few unlucky workers by a few bad apple employers. Rather, what I've found is that there are coherent, predictable patterns regarding the business models of forced labor and also the types of businesses that can profit from it. And I think, just to summarize, why are these anti-slavery initiatives failing? Well, one of the most obvious parts of the puzzle here is that none of them fundamentally challenge these business models in any way. So if we look at the design of initiatives like social auditing, we can see that there's often a mismatch between the pattern of forced labor in supply chains, what we know about forced labor, where the risks for it are, and then the design of those initiatives. So we might know that in a certain industry, forced labor is likely to take place at the base of the supply chain. And companies are often only auditing their first tier suppliers at the top of the supply chain. So they actually leave out portions of the supply chain where we know that these practices are very likely to thrive. Also, sometimes they draw loopholes around the workers that are most vulnerable. So for instance, in the cocoa industry, there's a loophole around hired labor. So that is the workers that the farmers hire to work on a kind of casual basis. And that is quite peculiar because we found that those workers are the most vulnerable workers in the whole cocoa industry. So they're actually not even included within these certification programs. The other issue is that is the issue of how these initiatives are implemented. As I mentioned, a lot of them rely on self-reported data from companies and on social auditing as the kind of main tool used to verify standards. And we know from a growing number of studies that those are not effective tools to detect or address forced labor in supply chains. So in terms of anti-slavery legislation, we have a similar problem, which is that it also does very little to challenge prevailing business models. The big problem with this legislation is that it doesn't actually require companies to do anything about the problem. It merely asks them to report on what they are doing, which could be nothing. They could say, I'm doing nothing to prevent or address forced labor in my supply chain, and they would still be in compliance with the law. Most of them aren't doing that. Most of the ones who are reporting are talking about CSR, they're talking about auditing, they're talking about certification, but they're not reporting on whether those measures that they're taking are actually effective. And the other issue there is that the majority of companies covered under the law in the US and the UK have yet to issue any statements at all. And I'm not aware of any consequences for having failed to do that. So there's really no enforcement of this legislation. So I think just to end, public and private governance, both sets of governance initiatives are falling short in tackling the financial drivers and the governance gaps that are giving rise to forced labor in supply chains. And these are the things that we need to tackle if we're gonna succeed, I think, in eradicating it. And I'd be happy to talk in the Q&A more about how we might do that. Thank you. Any questions? Yes, I see you at the back there, yeah.
Seems like one of the problems might just be that forced labor has somehow gotten totally implicated into a moral paradigm, and that's sort of precluding a clear view of what the real paradigm is. And so then from that follows that if you can just change people's hearts with these compliance measures that you were describing, and when we go to the grocery store, and all that does is make us feel more virtuous. And so have you guys given any thought about just changing the whole vocabulary around it?
I think that's an excellent point. I mean, we're trying. I think, part of the issue is the way that scholarship on modern slavery has evolved has been very tied into activist efforts around it. So you've had a lot of kind of activist scholars who've done this research, and their main interest has been in kind of raising awareness and communicating to policymakers that this is a problem that needs to be addressed, and how do you get attention towards these issues? It's often through a kind of moral, sensationalist approach that makes us feel very bad and want to act. And that in some ways makes sense if you sort of look at it, in the late 1990s when a lot of this research started, it just wasn't on the agenda at all. And people felt it was really urgent to get this on the agenda and to do it by any means. But I think now we're at a point in scholarship where we need to take a step back and we need to hold ourselves as academics researching these sorts of things to higher standards of research and of methodology. And part of that is about shifting these paradigms and sort of looking at it through different types of angles. I think the thing with business and supply chains, you put up value distribution, people are like, ugh, like that's not really what people want to think about when they think about forced labor. So it's a bit of a challenge, I think, for those of us who are interested in shifting that to figure out how to do that. Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, if you do shift the paradigm, what kind of remedies would you imagine would be more effective?
That's a great question. I mean, I'm very interested, first of all, in what you all would think, because you're lawyers, I'm a political scientist, so our specialization is like analyzing all the problems of the world. The other thing I would say is, the first thing I did with this research, because it's such a hot topic right now on the policy agenda, is I did a open access cut of the findings that are in a report. And with that, I did 3 policy briefs where I mapped out in very clear, very specific detail for auditors and for certification organizations, for big brands, and for government, what I think they need to do differently in concrete terms right now to address these problems. So I won't sort of go into all the details of that, but it's available on the project website, and you're very, very welcome to look at it. I think the big thing that I'm excited about right now that I wish we would see more of, and I wish that people would talk more about in the context of forced labor, are what are called worker-driven social responsibility programs. Has anyone heard of those? Yeah. So I think that, you have an example, it's called the Fair Food Program in Immokalee in Florida, where after many years of modern slavery in the tomato industry, you had workers really pushing for a new solution supported by activists who started a boycott campaign around tomatoes. And what you have ended up with there is a model that's now being called worker-driven social responsibility that's being rolled out in different sectors across the US right now and elsewhere. And in those cases, you have a binding agreement between brands and that involves workers, and you have an enforceable set of provisions. So it's a bit like a code of conduct, like we were talking about earlier, but it's codified in the law, and there are actual consequences. So if suppliers are found to have forced labor, then they face, they won't get the contract anymore, or there's like very heavy commercial consequences for those suppliers. There's a zero tolerance policy around forced labor, and I think that one of the key distinguishing features of these types of programs is that instead of having a for-profit industry of social auditors who are the ones monitoring things, you have workers monitoring things. So workers are the most familiar with labor conditions in any given sector. And so in these programs, workers are involved in setting up the initiatives, in running the hotlines, in kind of monitoring, instead of somebody who has potentially a financial incentive to represent the practices in a certain way. So I think if I had to pick one thing, that's one thing that I feel quite optimistic about, is that I think that some of the brands who are serious about these sorts of practices are becoming more open to those types of initiatives. Anything else? Yeah.
You mentioned how contract work was the gateway. Have you ever looked into like the cruise ships and the fact that they use contracts to get those people to work 9+ months for little to nothing?
I haven't looked at the cruise ships. I think that that would be a fascinating one as well. We know from the fishing industry that ships are dangerous for workers, and that, again, there are very few people really checking what's happening on these ships. And so I think that that's a really important industry that, you know, would be ripe for investigation. I haven't myself looked at it yet. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
I wonder whether you'd be willing to share how, if at all, your research on this has affected your own consumer habits? If it has, in what way?
Yeah, that's a really, I mean, that's a great question. I get asked all the time by my students, are you saying, you know, we shouldn't buy fair trade? Are you saying we should shop at this store and not this store? Like, what, you know, what does this all mean for me? And I guess what I would take away from it is that price, paying more for stuff, does not necessarily mean that there are higher labor standards. I think that that is something that comes through pretty clearly in my research, but also other research. And so, you know, so we need to look much more carefully at why we're paying more and where that money is going. So in a recent study of fair trade in the coffee industry, when they looked at how is the extra amount that consumers pay for fair trade, where is that extra money going? Very little of it was going to workers. A lot of it was going to coffee roasters within the supply chain, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but that might not be the part of the supply chain that's under the most pressure. And so I think one lesson I've taken from it is not to make the assumption that just because I pay more for something, that means I have less, I can feel less guilty for labor exploitation. And I guess that's helpful in the sense that the sort of big lesson that I've taken is just to try to buy less stuff. It's not to, you know, it's not to sort of buy this stuff instead of that stuff. It's to buy less stuff. And it's also, I think it's made me much more concerned about the role of the government because, you know, for instance, when we had the Guardian investigation about shrimp, as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, you know, there was a lot of pressure put on different governments to say, look, this is so widespread, we can imagine that, you know, most of the shrimp that's coming into this country is made with forced labor, and you should ban it at the point of entry into the UK. And the UK government said, actually, no, we'll leave it up to consumers, whether or not they want to buy goods that are made with forced labor. Fine, but my issue with that is when you look at some products now, like tea, most of the tea in the world, the tea is a very monopolized market. So even though there are different brands, if you sort of look at the top of the supply chain, you'll see 3 big companies. That's it. You know, and we can imagine that in monopolized markets, there will be reasonably consistent labor standards across some of these big companies. And so I guess I'm worried that we don't actually have that many options anymore in terms of, as consumers, if you go to the grocery store, we rely on things like certification, labels, and, you know, if my research and other research is starting to show that those are not accurate sort of things to base our assumptions on about the labor practices that go into those goods, then I guess we're in a situation where is it a reasonable expectation for consumers to be able to make those kinds of decisions about buying goods with forced labor versus not with forced labor? Because in some supply chains, I think it would be very difficult actually to find products that weren't made with forced labor or very bad labor exploitation. So I guess that's what I've taken away from it. Yes?
Did any of your sites have labor union agreements? And if they did you track whether those made a difference in the standards?
That's a great question. So yes, they did. In Assam, in northern India, all tea workers, there's one union that people are part of if they would like to be part of it. And we included a number of questions about the unions in our interviews. And I was quite disappointed actually because workers reported, that, especially in that case, that there was a lot of sort of conspiring with management. And so they would say, well, yes, I've reported this problem I've report, like with the electricity, we'd say, well, did you report this to the union? Or with housing that was falling apart, that sort of stuff. Yes, and the sense among the workers that we interviewed was very much that unions were not helping to improve the situation in any way. And actually, they were sort of part of the problem because they were colluding on some of these cases with the management. And so, as somebody who is firmly believes in kind of the principle that workers need to have rights, and that if they are part of unions and if they have collective action and collective bargaining rights, that will often translate into a higher ability to speak up when things aren't going well or when abuses are taking place. And it seemed that maybe that's true. People are speaking up, but in terms of like what's actually happening as a result, there's very little action. So it's not a very rosy picture of unions in our study, unfortunately. Yeah.
2 questions, just
Okay.
out of curiosity, I guess. Did you have any plantations to your cocoa that you identified by the random draw where you weren't able to go, where the owner said no? It surprises me a little bit, honestly, that they would let you on to the plantations to talk to the workers. And then I'm also curious how you selected the workers that you spoke to out of 10,000 workers on a plantation.
Yeah, those are great questions. So complicated. So we detailed the methodology for the study in about a 10-page section of the report, in part because I'm very keen for research on forced labor to be ethical. I think we have obligations as researchers not to endanger very vulnerable people, and also to do research in a way that's rigorous. A lot of research on forced labor, people kind of rock up at work sites and say, are you a victim of modern slavery? Yes, no. And it's really problematic for many different reasons. So I spent a lot of time, and in fact, I had a grant in the years preceding this project from the British Academy focused specifically on how can we research forced labor in a reliable, rigorous, ethical way that doesn't endanger people. And I was really benefited a lot from engagement with the International Labor Organization on that. They were part of my workshop series, and they have done a lot of research like this for a very long time. So I spent a lot of time thinking about the methodology, and I set it up in maybe a slightly unconventional way, which is the first thing to say about tea is that all labor lines in tea are open to the public. They must be accessible to the public. And so that was one reason for choosing tea as opposed to another type of commodity, because we knew that we would have some form of access. In cocoa, we had to go through the chiefs of the communities, and we had to ask their permission to be able to do the research. And so, yes, we, in some cases, weren't able to proceed. In tea, I don't think we had that issue, but more so the issue that tea plantations are very, very, very big, and they're very spread out. And so we had to sort of draw a feasibility radius where we said, we'll only go X number of hours from this city, and we'll only confine our study to kind of the plantations that are located within this geographical spread. And that was already maybe, say, 14 hours away from a city. So and by a city, it's more like a very small town. So we had to kind of balance a lot of trade-offs in terms of our safety, worker safety, and other things. The way that we did the worker interviews was that we had PhD students who were from that region recruiting the participants. They were hired by us as research assistants, and they were the ones that were recruiting participants and doing some of the interviews off-site with tea workers. And so we actually just had an open offer to interview workers if they would like to participate at a local sort of legal help clinic that was available to us to use for that. And so we didn't do it on the tea plantations because we thought that would have aroused suspicion. Also, the moment that I would have turned up, it would have compromised the research with workers at the tea plantations. So we had to be quite creative in how we set up that part of the study. I can tell you that, for instance, when I went to the tea plantations, I'd be shown around by the manager. So I did my research with the managers after all the worker interviews had been done. the sort of picture that I was shown as somebody who was white and from North America was very, very different than what our research team was able to find through their interviews. We interviewed people in many different languages as well. So we interviewed people in their native language, and that was really important. And there are many different dialects that are spoken in Assam and in Kerala amongst tea workers. So we had to put a lot of thought and a lot of effort, and that's why I think it was a quite labor-intensive study to undertake. But I hope that helps. Yeah, does that help?
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah, no, it does, I was just, yes, that answers, I was curious if, exactly the things you asked, if maybe perhaps the most vulnerable people wouldn't talk to you because they would feel like they were, but yeah.
That could be. I mean, we decided on certain demographic features that we wanted to include in our study. So we wanted people of different ages. We wanted men and women. We wanted, in the South, where you have a lot of migrant workers, we wanted people who had migrated and people who hadn't migrated. And so we selected participants on sort of according to these criteria. But yeah, there's always the possibility, actually, and it would be logical to expect that the most vulnerable workers wouldn't want to be interviewed for our study for different reasons. We worked with, in tea, this legal empowerment organization who's done a lot of work with tea workers over a long period in Assam, and they helped us sort of create our sampling strategy, and they felt that if we picked according to those criteria, we'd get kind of a big spread of different types of labor conditions. So that's what we went with. But as I said, our study is imperfect in all kinds of ways. It's just, I think the nature of this sort of research is that you have to be satisfied with the uncertainty in some ways of what you've found. Yeah.
But just a question just on if you were able to validate your research, like for instance, you said you worked with the chiefs, were you able through that portion to have some sort of process of validation of the numbers, or were they just not involved and supportive of that?
Like in bringing back the research to...
Yeah, because usually, so for example, we are doing right now a project in Kenya, and to be able, we're working much like you with the chiefs to get in and have access.
Yeah.
Then a big part of our research is having that government validate it and take some ownership of it. And I wanted to know what your experience was with that in this project.
That's a great question. We didn't do this. We didn't do that for this project. I think my sort of aim in terms of the changes I hoped would come from this project were much more about brands who were located in the UK and the UK government, because it was funded by the UK Research Council, and that was sort of what I felt like I was best positioned to contribute to building change around, having been involved in the UK Modern Slavery Act process that created that legislation, being involved in many other things. So the other week we had a roundtable on my research at the House of Lords with senior executives from the tea industry, most of the tea brands encompassed in my study, and I'm in dialogue and discussing with them a lot about this research and hopefully changing some of the ways that they deal with forced labor risks in their supply chain. So that was my main sort of interest on this. In another study that I've just been working on in the garment industry in India, our team is now going back and doing a lot of what you're saying. They're going back to the businesses, they're going back to different government stakeholders, and they're talking to them about what we found about labor exploitation in garments. And I'm not sure validation is going to happen in that context, but at the very least trying to get them on board and proactively thinking about some solutions for the problems that we identified. So that's great that you're doing that. Yeah.
In your opinion, what about the contracts made it so easy to fall into, slavery? I don't quite understand how that happened. Was it unequal bargaining?
Employment contracts? Yeah. That's a great question. I mean, I think it's something that's a little bit hard to comment on in the sense that we haven't done all of that data analysis yet. So we've just, as I said, wrapped up fieldwork for this a few months back, and then I've just done the first cut of the findings in our report that got published in end of May. And so I'm sort of early on still in trying to understand exactly those questions. I would say there are a few things that are relevant. One is that in tea, permanent workers they're the ones who have the entitlements to things like housing. And what that often means is that their whole families will be living on the tea plantation with them. So maybe many members of the family will be working on the same plantation for the same employer. And that can be contributing factor, I think, as a protective factor in that workers are not as disposable. There's more accountability built in because there will be potentially several members of the family who will be impacted by practices to one worker. Another thing I think as a just general rule, workers who have permanency would be more inclined to exert their rights and feel more able to exert their rights than people, especially people who are hired on a day labor contract or on short periods of time who may not feel that they're able to do that because they may lose access to employment in the face of not having any other options. So I would say those are some kind of preliminary thoughts, but we need to do a bit more work on that to really understand it. Yeah.
So in more of the US, we were talking about, especially in the immigration course, about what happens when someone does exert their rights during these temporary times, and that they sort of get blacklisted from other farms or industries and they just can't work at all.
Mm-hmm.
Did you see or was that ever brought up as a concern that if they were to demand something, that they would then not only get fired but be prevented from working in a different sort of farm or industry?
That's a great question. The way it came up mostly was it came up differently in tea and in cocoa. So in tea, there was retaliation, and workers explained it that if they were part of a protest, and say photos were taken or video was taken of the protest, they may not get paid for a few months afterwards. So they wouldn't necessarily lose their job; they'd still be working, but they would have retaliation in the form of not getting paid or getting their benefits deducted, getting fired. So there were those sorts of concerns about retaliation. In the cocoa industry, it's more that people wouldn't be able to find employment at all. So it was more similar. I'm not sure they didn't describe it as a blacklist, but it was more the concern that these communities are quite tight-knit in some ways, and that if you refuse to do, for instance, this practice of the extra labor that's not paid, that might be on another sort of farm as a condition of your employment, then you just won't be seen as a good worker, and therefore, you won't be able to work in this industry. So it came up more that way in the studies, in the sectors we looked at. Yeah. Yeah.
So you talked about enforceability being a really big issue.
Yeah.
Do you think that's where we should be putting resources in a push for enforceability, or do you think that they're so inadequate that they should just be totally rewritten, which would be a whole nother issue, but as far as enforceability for the standards that did somehow exist, but you said were worthless because there's no punishment for things like that?
In the case of government standards, like the Modern Slavery Act, those sorts of things, or more in the private ones?
I was thinking the private ones because you were talking about how they existed, but then essentially nothing happened.
There's no auditing. I think that's tricky. I mean, I've written elsewhere a lot about the problems of auditing, not just in this sector, but in consumer goods and in other contexts. I think there are some problems that no matter how stringent the enforcement provisions were, it would be quite hard to imagine a situation where things like certification and auditing were the solution to these problems. For instance, as long as you have a sort of financial conflict of interest where auditors or certifiers depend on these brands to stay in business, and they're the ones commissioning the audit, I think you're gonna have some trade-offs there in terms of how stringent they are, and that varies by company. So when we interviewed auditors, they'd say, well, how deep we go into the supply chain, how rigorous our audit is, it really varies based on the company, because some of them are kind of paying us to find that things are not there. And some of them really genuinely want to know what is there, right? And so you have a huge variation amongst companies commissioning these things of how deep and meaningful they want these exercises to be. And I guess my worry is that as long as that ability remains for companies to sort of decide their own rules and decide how stringent they would like these things to be, I think you're going to have some difficulty making those meaningful processes. So I guess in that sense, I think one of the things that's very hard to overlook, there's been this parallel concern about modern slavery. And on the other hand, if you look at the numbers, you've had a massive decline in kind of labor inspection in general in many parts of the world. And I think if I were going to try to up enforcement budgets, that would be the thing I'd be trying to up, because I think in many countries now, including the United States, interestingly, you have a situation where there's such a low chance of being inspected if you're a business or held accountable, really, that that these are kind of viable business practices in many cases. And I think that's where I'd really be putting my money, if I had some, into just creating a context where there are boots on the ground that kind of make it harder for these to be viable business models. Where would you put your money?
Well, I'm a law student, so I would put it in laws that are written probably, but, I'd be writing those, so I guess I'm biased too, because I want someone to pay me.
Yeah.
This is probably more of a comment than a question.
Sure.
But through your presentation and your comments and some of the answers, what kind of strikes me is that what we're looking at maybe is more of a social issue, and that we all know and agree that slavery is bad. I don't think you're hard pressed to find someone that will tell you labor, slavery, any kind of slavery is bad.
Yeah.
But the issue becomes that once some form of payment is being made, to some that seems sufficient. Like, they're no longer slaves, we don't need to worry. But the problem, from your research shows that just because there's some payment, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily a fair wage or even a living wage. Because it also reminded me of some of the stories that came out of the coal mines in the late 19th, early 20th century, where you have that sort of, you can't really leave, you're indebted. If you do anything organized, you could be physically harmed, you could lose your job, like all these things that could happen to you.
Yeah.
So to me, it just seems like we have to have this social conversation of just because some sort of minimum is being met here, or some form of payment, it's not enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. I think, it's been, I think, a fairly intentional strategy by some to disconnect the idea of modern slavery from labor rights. There's been a lot of NGOs and a lot of companies who have made those separate topics. And I think one of the things that we lose in that is that, as I mentioned before, when people are researching or thinking about these topics, things like wages are just not on the radar screen. But research is now starting to show that low wages create high vulnerability to forced labor. So I think you're exactly right. I think there needs to be a conversation about kind of going back to that chart. Is this enough of a share of value, to expect that, workers who are working in profitable industries, these are not profitable industries, is that fair? Is that sustainable, even as a society? And I think it's kind of a question of where people want to draw the line on what is an acceptable form of remuneration. Is 25% of the poverty line for picking 200 pounds of tea a day, is that acceptable? Are we okay with that? And I think it's a really hard thing. It's a really hard conversation to have. So it's maybe not surprising that it's been evaded for so long. But I think we need to start looking at it in those ways. So I think you're exactly right. Yeah. Any other questions? Oh, yes, go ahead.
I think similar to what several people have said, I have been involved in whether it's human trafficking, forced labor for many years. And one of the things that I commend you for in your presentation is a word, you talked about definitions, and a word that has roots and resolutions, whether it's globally or here in the US, is the word plantation. Every time you said plantation, I was grabbing the table a little, because that immediately said, okay, what's next? What is next in the presentation about what does it mean? Because I think oftentimes we hear the word farms, and we have these laborers on the farms, which is especially used in the Southeast with the migrant workers as it relates to tobacco and cotton. And so we have, when you start saying plantation, there are laws and so forth that come to mind. And so I'm wondering if part of this conversation, as you're talking with these governments, because many of them have laws in place there, and then you start looking at things that have been outlawed based on this is not enough wages for your labor. So when you say they're getting below the poverty line, well, enslaved Africans in the South, east of the United States especially, they received rations for food, or if they ran extra errands, they were given maybe $1 or a coin. $1 was big then for if it was a big something, usually something legal task, but that's a collateral point there. But there are already laws there, and I'm wondering for those of us who work in the area from a legal standpoint, are there things that come to mind legally based on some of the terminology you all have chosen to use with your research that could help us?
Yeah, that's a great question. Wow, that's a really great question. I think it's funny because my first research project in this kind of general area was on prison labor, and it really struck me then in Louisiana that you have a lot of prison workers working for the government on the same plantations that were slave plantations. And I find it, we can't overlook that. Like, there's just this huge continuity in these types of practices, and who's vulnerable to them, who's making money from them. This stuff goes way back. And so I think you're right. I hadn't really thought about it necessarily in this context, but I think that is such an important part of the story. In India, I think one of the reasons I chose plantations is because the main law that governs the conditions of tea workers is called the Plantations Act. And so all of the practices that I've documented are illegal under this act. And right now there are a lot of conversations in India about reforming that act. Companies are saying it's not viable for us to provide all of these services to workers. It's just not viable. There are too many workers, and tea prices are going down, and we just can't do it. And so there are these conversations happening now about kind of how that act should be reformed. The minimum wage has gone up. It's not being realized. And so there's, that act is really in flux. And so I know that doesn't help lawyers maybe based here, but I know there are a lot of lawyers in India who are really working hard on the Plantations Act there, and trying to reform it in such a way that improves some of the conditions there. I think it would be fascinating to think about, what sort of the legal profession in countries like the US and the UK could be doing around some of these issues around plantations. And I think you're probably much better qualified than me to share thoughts. But I think, it's spot on as a question.
Just sort of to raise a point, if you actually look at the recent Australian Modern Day Slavery Act that came out, I think one of the big problems when we're talking exactly like you've actually pointed out about modern slavery is that we have a very fragmented approach where everybody has their own angle, their own argument to make, and NGOs, when we're lobbying governments, unfortunately, we are competitive. And we are not speaking with each other. So what we end up having is this fragmented approach where one part gets left off and this part of the agenda is upheld. And this is exciting and otherwise. So I think it really is also incumbent on young lawyers in the room when we are working on such topics to make sure that we're really collaborating and we're trying to see the agenda from all places, because it's not only plantations, it's supply chains from the vacations we take to the things we wear to everything we eat. But I completely agree with you. So my advice to law students would be really to come together and work, all of us, like you and I now are gonna be friends and work together because we have different sides of the coin, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think some of the most inspiring people I've met in this field are lawyers. I was just telling Sona earlier about a lawyer who I know who's been litigating a lot of cases in the US on some of these topics. And what's interesting there is that you have a lot of people who have worked traditionally in immigration law, teaming up with corporate lawyers, teaming up with people who have been kind of in more human rights sides, and looking at this in different angles and being quite creative, I think, now, and trying to think about what range of kind of legal possibilities there are and how they could be pursued. So there's a lot of very exciting work, I think, on these topics from different angles of the law. And I feel maybe most hopeful about some of that work compared to other, political science isn't doing doing so much on this. So I think that's really exciting. Yeah.
So we'll have
Oh.
one more question and then.
Okay.
I thank you for coming, and once again, I apologize for interrupting you twice. In the interest of coming up with, tough solutions and thinking critically about, how we're approaching things, my peer made a statement, how have your consumer habits changed in doing your research? And you said, I'm going to consume less. And I challenge you, how does that help the situation? Because if people are being exploited on these farms, or plantations, and you take away their jobs, what other options do they have? Does that not exacerbate it? And is it not more indicative that the act that controls how tea plantations should be ran isn't even followed? Is it not that the rule of law in these societies are not even being followed, more than just a simple consumer issue, really?
That's a good question. I mean, I wouldn't hesitate to acknowledge that the lacking enforcement of the law is a big problem, right? But going back to the sort of picture that I showed at the very beginning about the global commodity chains, I think that one thing that is very difficult about that is that, especially with climate change, where it's now possible to grow tea in other parts of the world, if the government did enforce that law, supply would shift. So buyers would start buying more tea from Kenya and from Malawi and from other countries, which they're already doing anyway. And so, there are big challenges on that, right? Because on the one hand, you have a situation where the rules of the game of the global economy are such that for this tea to be sold at all, and to compete on this kind of global market, governments feel that they can't enforce laws. And so I think on that side, you have a situation where, it's absolutely the case that the global economy is set up in a way that is very difficult. And I wouldn't say they don't need to enforce the law. I still think they need to enforce the law, but there are also big consequences for doing that.
Oh, absolutely.
And so I think that's a really important point. In that sense, I guess I feel that buyers have a special responsibility in that they can make it possible to follow the law. It doesn't necessarily mean if they pay more for tea that money will necessarily go directly to workers. But there are a couple of companies that are now looking at that, looking at saying, okay, we would pay a bit more, because certification is expensive, right? They're paying a lot of money for fair trade certification, Rainforest Alliance certification, and they were doing it as a sort of insurance policy. And now I think it's interesting that some of them are turning away from that and starting to think about other ways of investing that money. And one of the things some of them are looking at is living wages. And so I guess I feel like that's quite a promising direction forward. The other point you mentioned is also really important, but I know we have to leave this room and I'm looking at it and it's 1:30, so I think I might leave it to chat about afterwards if you're happy with that. Okay, thank you.